Picture this.
In a Europe drowning in fire and smoke, some decisions were made in just a few seconds, yet they changed the fate of an entire nation. And today, you're about to hear a story you'll never find in any textbook. You know, whenever people talk about the Japanese Banzai charges of World War II, most imagine these wild, furious assaults, hundreds of men rushing forward like an unstoppable wave. And in some ways, they're right. But what people talk about far less is what it felt like on both sides. The almost blind confidence of the attackers and the cold, breathless silence of the men waiting for them in the dark. I want you to picture this. Night falls on Guadalcanal. No moon, no lights, only the buzzing insects of the tropical jungle and the breaths of Marines trying to keep their hands from shaking. On the other side, in the darkness they cannot see, is a Japanese formation convinced they're about to recreate the miracles that happened in the Philippines and Malaya. You know, the places where Banzai attacks shattered entire defensive lines within hours. And to them, that victory wasn't luck. It came from belief, almost a religious belief, that samurai spirit could overcome anything. Tenno Heika Banzai wasn't just a battle cry, it was a declaration, a vow. It was like the way some people, in the darkest moments of their lives, tell themselves that if their will is strong enough, every limit can be broken. Have you ever felt that way? That moment when you think sheer mental strength can make up for everything else? But war doesn't run on feelings, and on Guadalcanal, that was especially true. What the Japanese didn't know, and this is the part historians like us keep repeating, is that the Americans had quietly set up a web of interlocking fields of fire, woven together like steel threads, forming what the Marines called a killing funnel. No drama, no heroics, just a structure built on cold math, combat experience, and the fear of being overrun by an enemy they didn't fully understand. As a historian, I've read countless memoirs from both sides, and the thing that haunts me most is how each described the moments before the battle. The Japanese walked forward with absolute confidence, believing pure willpower would carry them through the bullets just as it had before. The Americans stayed silent in the dark, trying to remember every drill they'd practiced for hours: load, lock, adjust, hold. Not to be heroes, just to stay alive. A former Marine gunner once wrote a line I've never forgotten. "We didn't hate them, we were just afraid of them, and afraid of ourselves." That's the truth of war. No glory, just human beings with fear, belief, and choices. So what do you think? One side believed spirit could conquer firepower. The other believed preparation was the only path to survival.
And every time I tell the story of the night before that attack,
I'm struck by how human it all is. The Japanese believed their cries of "Tenno Heika Banzai" would terrify the Americans, that sheer determination would break the enemy's line. But they didn't know the Marines had been waiting for hours, adjusting firing angles, listening for every rustle, preparing for the close-quarters assault they knew was coming, even if they didn't know just how brutal it would be. Let me paint it even clearer. Imagine standing at a major turning point in your life. You believe you have enough spirit, enough determination, enough will. But ahead of you lie things you can't see, can't predict, can't understand. Things prepared long before you arrived, and you only realize it when you run straight into them. That willpower alone isn't always enough. Guadalcanal was exactly that. The Japanese charged in with samurai spirit, the same spirit that had turned a small island nation into a military powerhouse. But this time, their opponent wasn't an unprepared army. The Americans had learned, fast, and in the darkness of that jungle, every Banzai shout, every belief in a miracle was stopped by a network of firepower precise enough to feel almost surgical. You see, sometimes in history, just like in life, there are moments when two worlds collide: belief versus reality, will versus preparation. And that moment on Guadalcanal began on a moonless night, with two armies believing in two completely different truths. Have you ever experienced something like that? A moment when you thought you were ready, until you realized you were stepping into a killing funnel you never knew existed? For the Japanese, the battle became a painful lesson. For the Americans, it was the moment they understood the true brutality of the war they were fighting. And for all of us today, it's a story that forces us to think about belief, preparation, and the thin line between courage and tragedy. I want you to keep imagining that scene, but this time, listen. Not to the insects, but to that tight, suffocating silence of men who know that in just a few minutes, life and death will melt into each other like two black streams in the night. In that darkness, the American Marines pressed themselves flat against the ground. No one dared speak. No one dared swallow too loudly. They waited for one single signal, one footstep, one snapped twig, anything that told them the approaching force had stepped into the kill zone. And then, almost at the same moment, they all heard it. A faint rustle, far too steady to be an animal. A young private wrote in his memoir, "I couldn't see them, but I could feel the intensity coming toward us." I want you to relive that moment with them. Imagine hundreds of men advancing toward you, unaware that death is waiting at the end of the path they're running down. And you, gripping a 37mm gun, can't see their faces either. You only know that when they appear, everything will happen too fast for you to think about who's right or wrong. The distance between the two sides closes to 125 yards. That's when Hightower, the gun crew's commander, gives the signal. Not a dramatic arm swing, no shouted "Fire!" like in the movies. Just a nod. A small movement, so small you could miss it if you blinked. But to the Marines holding their breath beside him, it was the moment that released hours of coiled tension. And then the first shot roared out. If you've never heard a 37mm cannon firing in a tropical jungle at night, let me tell you what many veterans described. It doesn't sound like a gun. It sounds like a steel door being blown off its hinges by an invisible rage, a blast that shakes your chest, a tear ripping through the night itself. And in that split second, the Japanese soldiers began to understand that what they were charging into wasn't a weak, panicked line. They had walked straight into the heart of a coldly engineered killing machine. The canister round left the barrel at terrifying speed, bursting into hundreds of steel balls that smashed into the Japanese formation like a storm of metal. One Marine later wrote, "It was like watching a river of men, and then someone takes a giant blade and slices straight through it." That wasn't a metaphor. It was literal. A gap nearly 30 yards wide opened in the formation, so fast that many of the Japanese soldiers behind it didn't even understand what had happened. But the drama didn't end there. Seconds after the first shot, the crew reloaded. In one memoir, a gunner wrote that he relied entirely on feel. Left hand finding the shell, right hand pulling the breech, everything happening in the dark, at a speed that felt almost instinctive. They had practiced this dozens of times, but when real war hits, You don't think about the motions, you just do them, and hope you do them right. The second round fired, and in that second blast, the turning point of the entire attack happened. Colonel Kiyonao Okata, commander of the Banzai force, was hit by dozens of steel balls. He fell almost instantly. No shout, no order, just a sudden emptiness in the formation, the emptiness left by the man who had been leading them. You may not be a soldier, but I'm sure you felt something similar. You're charging forward with all your belief, and then the person you rely on suddenly disappears. The whole world tilts. That is exactly what happened to the Japanese force that night. When their commander fell, the hundreds of men behind him plunged into a chaos none of them had ever been trained to face. A Banzai charge depends on momentum and spirit.
When momentum is cut,
And spirit is hit right in the heart, everything collapses faster than any military report can ever describe. And then the next shots began ripping through the treetops. The 37mm cannon fired at an almost inhuman pace, 12 to 15 rounds per minute. Canister shots flew out one after another, each blast carving another huge chunk out of the Japanese formation. In those flashes of muzzle light, you could see silhouettes break off, men running sideways, men searching for cover where there was none, and others still charging forward as if trying to cling to a miracle they believed would come. An American officer watching from an observation post later said the feeling wasn't victory at all. He said, "I'd never seen anything so brutal and so sad." That's war, when the climax isn't a heroic moment, but the instant you realize you're witnessing another human being's belief collapsing in front of your eyes. What stays with me most from this battle is the silence of the jungle after each volley. No one spoke, no one cheered, no one celebrated. The Americans just kept loading. The Japanese kept charging. And in the space between them was a tragedy an entire generation would carry for the rest of their lives. Have you ever watched something so big, so fierce, so unstoppable, until it crashed into an invisible wall? That was this moment. The climax of the battle wasn't in the gunfire. It was in the raw truth that both sides entered that night with different beliefs, and only one of them truly understood what they were walking into. And as the night was ripped open by bursts of flame, the Battle of Guadalcanal entered an entirely new chapter. When dawn finally spread across Guadalcanal, the jungle in front of the Marines wasn't a jungle anymore. It was a frozen tableau. Stretching from the tree line all the way to the riverbank were 783 Japanese bodies, a number so staggering that even the most battle-hardened Marines stood still for a long moment, unable to fully believe what they were looking at. One American officer wrote, "We had never seen a battle so short, yet so heavy on the soul." You might think this was a victory, but to the men standing there that morning, victory wasn't the word they would have used. What they felt was emptiness. When the enemy is gone and the gunfire has faded, what remains is the oldest question in war. Why must humans push themselves to such extremes before realizing the futility of violence? Interestingly, Japanese records after this battle show that the once unshakable faith in the Banzai charge began to crack. They called canister rounds the steel cloud, something no warrior, no matter how brave, could break through. Meanwhile, the Americans learned a different lesson. Preparation, discipline, and adaptability had saved their lives. They dramatically increased the stockpiles of canister ammunition across the entire Pacific front, because they knew the war was far from over. And for us today, this story isn't just about a single battle. It's a reminder that belief, courage, and a willingness to sacrifice only carry meaning when paired with understanding and preparation. What do you think about that? If this story helped you see history through a clearer, more human lens, there's so much more waiting for you. Hit like, subscribe, and share so we can keep uncovering the moments that shaped the world. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.